So we're still absorbing tonight's breaking news from the Washington Post, which reports that, according to U.S. intelligence intercepts that have been described by current and former U.S. officials, Russia's ambassador to Washington told his superiors in Moscow that he discussed Trump campaign matters, including Russia-related policies, with Jeff Sessions during last year's presidential race. That's a big deal because even once Jeff Sessions admitted that he did have contacts with Russian officials during the campaign, despite the fact that he'd previously denied it, even once he admitted to it, he explicitly said, as Attorney General, he explicitly said that when he had had those contacts with Russians, he did not discuss the Trump campaign with any Russian operatives or intermediaries. Now the Post says, citing a former official, the intelligence indicates that Sessions and Kislyak had substantive discussions on matters, including Trump's positions on Russia-related issues and prospects for U.S.-Russia relations in a Trump administration. Again, it could be that Kislyak was lying to the Kremlin, and really he didn't talk about anything of consequence with Jeff Sessions. But this story comes after the president told the New York Times he wishes he had never chosen Jeff Sessions to be his attorney general. After senior Trump aides told the Times they were stunned when Jeff Sessions didn't quit following that criticism from the president. He also told the Times that he essentially hinted that Jeff Sessions had lied to the Senate in his sworn testimony during his confirmation hearings. If Jeff Sessions does resign, or if the president fires him, if President Trump gets to nominate a new attorney general, one who presumably would not have to be recused from overseeing the Russia investigation, then it would seem like getting rid of Attorney General Jeff Sessions would put President Trump one giant step closer to being able to end the Russia investigation by firing Robert Mueller. Is that the right way to look at it? People who really understand the law here, who really understand how government lawyers work, is that correct? And if that is correct, then what would happen to the Russia investigation once Trump went after Mueller? Joining us now is somebody who knows these things. Bob Bauer was former White House counsel to President Obama. Mr. Bauer, I really appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you for your time.
Certainly. Thank you.
Let me just ask you first about what I was just saying there about the removal of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. If he quits or resigns and the president does get to name a new acting attorney general and then appoint somebody new for that job, is that potentially a path for him to end the Mueller investigation?
He might think of it that way. He or his lawyers might also think of it as a way to make sure that they exercise a little more control, or they feel they can exercise a little bit more control over Mueller. They may believe the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, is no longer able to do that. And as you know, they have expressed this concern that Mueller is expanding his mandate to include the president's finances, that he's, if you will, sort of veering out of control. Sessions can't do anything about it, and they may think that Rosenstein can't do anything about it. So they may feel their best bet is to have a new attorney general who is not recused.
If either through the Rosenstein path or through the getting rid of Jeff Sessions path, they are able somehow down the road to figure out a way to fire Bob Mueller, in that instance, is there any other part of the law enforcement, any other part of the justice system in this country that could take up the investigation in Mueller's wake?
As a practical matter, I mean, eventually, while it might be difficult for them, there are some roadblocks along the way, if you will, to firing Mueller. President Trump could get there if that's what he was determined to do. At that point, fundamentally, it becomes a question for the Congress. I think at that point, the attention is going to shift from an incapacitated Department of Justice to a Congress that would have to consider articles of impeachment.
I believe that in the abstract. I believe that as a student of political science. I'm also looking ahead, though, to what is going to happen in the Senate next week. I think that in the Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley is signaling with a subpoena that he says he's issuing tonight with his cancellation of testimony from Paul Manafort and Donald Trump Jr., that the congressional Republicans who more or less support President Trump are about to start sort of a political counteroffensive to try to create a competing narrative, to try to make the Russia scandal a Democratic scandal. Because it at least feels to me as an observer that that's about to happen, it's hard for me to believe that anything the president's going to do about this Russia investigation would result in Republicans newly looking at this as potentially impeachable potentially impeachable acts.
I'm not certain. I think that if President Trump does something that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have publicly warned him not to do. And in his own interest, he fires Mueller, having expressed dissatisfaction about being under investigation at all, of having the investigation expand to include his finances. I think it might trigger a very powerful counter-reaction from the Congress. Now, obviously, that's hard to predict, but this is going to sound too much to people like Watergate, too much like a president interfering with the law enforcement process in his own interest. And that's something that's going to resonate, I think, frankly, across party lines.
Bob Bauer, former White House counsel for President Obama. I have 2 additional questions for you on very specific matters. Can you stick around for a bit to make me smarter?
Certainly.
All right, we'll be right back with Bob Bauer right after this.